Happy coding.
Hey there, Kevin here, and welcome to our next video in our series of Intro to Web Dev. In this video, we're going to learn about a specific function called the fetch function, and it might sound like, we're spending a whole video on a single function, and that is because this function is super powerful. It's really important because it lets you get, well, pretty much anything from other sort of URLs. So this unlocks some really interesting things when we get to APIs, but for now, I want to start with like the fetch function itself because it can be a little confusing at first. So I'm just going to kind of get started, and I have a glitch project open to the template that I've been using this entire time, and the only thing I've really done is add a script.js file. Right now that script.js file is empty, but I'm gonna fill that up in a second. So what I want to do is maybe first start with like the problem statement, and let's say that I actually have another file, and I'll call it like, I don't know, message.txt. So it's just going to be a text file, no HTML yet anyway. And in this message.txt file, I'm going to say like, welcome to my website. The content doesn't really matter, but let's say I have some text content in here. And I want to put that into my index.html file or into any HTML file that I have in my project. How would I do that? Well, with what we've learned so far, there isn't really a great way. You could, copy paste it. Maybe you could maybe do something like an iframe that might work, but the sort of better way would be to use something called the fetch function to fetch the data from that file. In this case, it's just text, and then use DOM manipulation like document.getElementById and inner text to add that content to the page. So that's what I'm going to show, now. So just to sort of get started, I'm going to maybe add like a div up here, maybe a p tag, doesn't really matter. I'll start with a p tag, why not? And I'll give this an ID of like, I don't know, message-container. And right now that p tag is just empty because I haven't actually added anything to it. I could say like loading in here and then replace it in a second, but I'll just keep it. Maybe I'll stick with loading for now. And then what I want is maybe an onload function so that after my HTML loads, then I'm going to call a function. So I'm going to say onload, I don't know, like show message maybe. And then finally, I need to define that in my JavaScript. So if I go here to script.js, I'm going to say function show message, and then I'm going to do something. And for now, I'm just going to maybe console.log, and then I'll say here to double check that this is actually working. So let's open up my JavaScript console, and indeed, way down there in the lower left, there it is. And I don't know if I can have a better way for this to be. Yeah, maybe we'll see. We'll see if I bring that back or not. But for now, this proves that my JavaScript is hooked up to my HTML, and I'm pretty happy about that. So to iterate, what I might do is use a little bit of DOM manipulation to add like a kind of a arbitrary message. So I'll say let what do I call that, message container equals document dot get element by ID, and then message dash container. Is that what I called it? I never remember when I'm going back and forth between multiple files. So message container, yes. So I have the element in my JavaScript, so then I can say something like message container dot inner text equals, I'll just say like testing. And okay, so now this works. I have testing up here. And what this proves is not only is my JavaScript hooked up to my HTML, but it goes the other way too, where my JavaScript is messing with my HTML. And now my end goal is to get whatever value, whatever content is in message.txt into my JavaScript and then add it to my page. So that's where the fetch function comes into play. So I'm going to maybe move some of this down, I guess. And I'm going to say create a variable. I'm going to say let, I don't know, response equals, and then I'm going to set it equal to whatever is returned from the fetch function. So I'm going to fetch, and what am I going to fetch? I'm going to fetch the file that I have, message.txt. And we'll see in a second that this is a URL. So right now I'm using a relative URL because the message.txt file is like right next to everything else. And that's, fine. But if it was somewhere else, I could use like a full path starting with HTTPS. But for now, I'm going to just fetch that. And I think I'll just console.log it. So I'm going to console.log the response, and response. Okay. All right. So if I open up my JavaScript console, I should see that when the page is loaded, maybe I should have done this when I pushed a button to make it a little easier, but this is just when the page loads. So right away, I call the fetch function with the name of my file, and then I'm just printing out the response I get back for now. And if I look at what is printed out, I see, oh, it's going to get annoying, way down here at the bottom, I see response object promise. Like, what is that? Why isn't it this content, or at least something interesting? And that is because what the fetch function returns is not necessarily a specific value. It's something called a promise, which in JavaScript is a sort of container for some action that will take an unknown amount of time. So this is important because if you think about, how the internet works, you've probably been like on your phone kind of in the middle of nowhere and you have like one bar of service and, the internet's really slow. And if you are in that sort of environment, then when you call something like the fetch function, when you go request something off of the internet, you don't want your phone to freeze up. You don't want your computer to just say, well, I'm just going to wait here forever until the response comes back, because it could take, a second, could take a minute, could take forever. You don't know. So when you call a function like the fetch function, which is called an asynchronous function, the code actually keeps running while in the background, it goes and fetches that URL. So if you try to use the value directly, it won't really work because you don't have the value yet. What you have is a promise for the value. So what you can do is instead you use what are called callback functions. And a callback function is essentially a way for you to say, hey, JavaScript, I know that you are going and fetching that URL that I asked you for, and when you are done, go call this function. And I'll show you what that looks like. So we have seen that the response itself is a promise, and promises have a few handy functions that you can use. And the important one here is the then function. So what I'm going to do is first I'll define a function down here. So I'll say something like function. For now, I'll call it process response, and I'm going to close this because it's going to get annoying. Process response, and that's going to take a response as an argument. Okay, and then in here, I'm just going to steal this line of code and print it out to the console directly. So now that I have this function, which takes a response and then does something with it, I can say to my promise, hey, promise, when you're done, so response dot then, so this is a promise, and when that promise comes back, then call the process response function. And if I look at my JavaScript console, what will I see? I will see something slightly different. Now I can see that I am printing out not a promise, but a response. So that's an object that contains some data. So if I go to, I don't know, a search engine, I type in JavaScript response object, I might be able to see the functions and fields that it gives me. And let's see, is this right? Yeah, maybe. I've got some information about like what the response came back with, like, do I have like any error messages or anything like that? And I also have, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, here. So I can convert the underlying response to some text. So you will call one of these functions based on the kind of data that you expect. For now, we are just expecting text data. So I will call the response.text function. So let's try that. So down here in my process response function here, I will say, well, I'm going to close this because it's going to get annoying. What I'll say is something like, I don't know, let text equals response dot text, and then I will print out text and text. Okay, so I am now saying when I process the response, like after my initial fetch promise comes back, I'm going to call the process response function, and in the process response function, I am going to convert it into text or get the text out of the response and then print it out. Let's see. So if I open up my JavaScript console, then I see, oh man, I see that text is itself a promise. And why? Why is that? That is because some responses can be really, really, really big. So it can take a really long time to convert it from, the response object that comes back like from the request into text. So because you don't know exactly how long it's going to take, it returns a promise. So we have to do essentially the exact same thing. Where we have a callback function. So maybe I'll say like function, and I'm going to close this because I'm going to get annoying. Something like, I don't know, handle text, and then this will take text. And for now, I'll just print it out. So here, I'll just steal this line of code. And then the magic is because I have this function, I can use it as a callback function. So I'm going to say text dot, and text is itself a promise, dot then handle text. Okay, and again, I'm just giving it the name. I'm not actually giving it, like, I'm not calling the handle text function myself. I am saying, hey, this promise, hey, text promise, when you're done, then call this handle text function, and then it will give you the actual value that's like inside of the promise, and you can print it out. So actually, I'm kind of annoyed with myself that I probably should have given these better names. So I'm going to rename some of these. So this should have been like response promise. And this should have been like text promise. Maybe it makes a little more sense to do it that way. Yeah. So starting sort of at the top, I have this show message function, which is just called onLoad. And I call the fetch function, and that gives me a promise for a response. And then I say, hey, response promise, whenever you're done, then call my process response function. And what happens is JavaScript will go make the request, and when it comes back, it will call the process response function with the underlying response. So this is no longer a promise. This response is the response. It's not a promise. So you can work with it directly. That's why it was an object. And what I do is I ask for the text from the response. That itself is a promise. So I store that in text promise. And then I say, hey, however long it takes you to convert that into text, cool. Whenever you're done, then call my handle text function. And finally, when you get down here, this text is not a promise. This is the actual underlying text. So it takes like 2 jumps to go from a request to a response to the underlying like data that was inside the response. But now, drum roll, if I look at what prints to my console, I see indeed text, welcome to my website. So I have fetched the data from my other file, and now I can work with it. And the important thing is that like these are asynchronous. So the functions don't run like right away as you might sort of expect as like code has been running. So if I try to do something like use this text up here, this won't work because this code will actually run before this code, which feels weird because wait, aren't I calling the process response function and then I'm calling the handle text function like before any of this? And no, you're actually not. And this is where it gets kind of trippy because these are asynchronous functions. So you're saying, or specifically the fetch function is asynchronous. So you're saying, go off and do your thing. And whenever you're done, call this function. Meanwhile, I'm going to keep going. So it runs this code before it actually comes back, or, kind of depends on the timing, but like it's before. So in other words, what I need to do is basically move this down to where I actually have access to the underlying text. And so now that I have the text, instead of printing it to the console, I can add it to my HTML. So here I'll say text, maybe I'll zoom out. So what I'm kind of staring at is like up here, this testing should change into my, the data that I'm fetching. So I'm going to change this to text and ta-da. Now I have welcome to my website up here, and I'm going to prettify this a little bit, but what I have is 3 functions, and the show message function, which I should probably rename now to like fetch message or something, but that's fine. This is called onload, so automatically, and I call the fetch function and I say, hey, go fetch the content of this file, and whenever you're done, then call process response. Okay, process response is then automatically called by JavaScript because you passed it in as a callback function here, and it calls your function with the response, and you can then work with that response object to convert it into text, or there are other things you can convert it to, but for now we're just using text. That itself is a promise, so you can you give it its own callback function here, and then finally this callback function is resolved when you have the underlying content that you can then use, and you can use it however you want, and in this case I am adding it to my page up here. So that works, but it's pretty annoying to think about, honestly. Promises are a little wonky, and if right now you're like, what just happened, what is he talking about, that's actually pretty normal when you're dealing with promises, because they're a little weird at first, because of that like asynchronous nature where your code is sort of called out of order. The good news is that there are many ways to work with promises. I'm starting with maybe like the most I don't know, like straightforward maybe, but also confusing. It's weird. But you can also use other concepts with promises that make them a little more concise. But I wanted to start with this to sort of talk through like the underlying mechanism of what's happening. But really, chances are you probably won't end up writing code that looks like this. Instead, I'm going to work through a few ways of working with promises, and I want to leave it up to you, like which choice, which approach makes the most sense to you. So to get started, I'm going to change maybe just one thing, and that's this like process response function. Instead of calling the then function, I'm going to just return the text promise actually. So I'm going to say return text promise. And what this lets me do is put like most of my logic up here. So what do I say? I say response promise equals whatever I get from fetching this, which is itself a promise, so response promise. Then I say call the process response function. But what I want to do is store the returned value in a variable. So I can say let text promise equals, and I'm setting it equal to whatever I get from calling this process response function after the response comes back. And then finally, I can say text promise dot then handle text. And let's zoom out a little bit to make sure that this actually works. And it does. And I haven't really changed a ton. However, what I have changed is now like my logic is sort of all in this function. You can sort of reason about it without jumping down. So I'm saying go fetch message.text, store it in this response promise variable. Whenever that's done, call this process response function, and whatever that thing does, store it in this variable, and we know that's going to be a promise, so we call it text promise. And then whenever that promise is done, go handle the actual text. And the underlying thing that it doesn't really change, but it changes like where your code is sort of focused. So that's one way you might rearrange your code to make your promises a little easier to think about. Another way that you might work with promises is with something called promise chaining. And really that is just getting rid of this middle variable. So what I can do is I can say, instead of storing it in variables, I'm going to say call the fetch function, and I know that that's going to give me a promise. So I'm going to directly call the .then function because I know it's a promise, and I'm going to give it this first jump here. So I'm going to say fetch message.text, then process the response, and usually you put it on a new line, and then handle the text. Okay, and I'm going to delete this because I no longer need that, and I'm going to put some spaces here, and if I zoom out, that should still work, and indeed it does. Let's just refresh to double check, and yeah. So this code is doing the exact same thing as before. We're just not going through those intermediate variables. It's saying fetch message.text, and then process the response, and then handle the text. And the mechanisms are the same. You're still calling then on these returned promises. But because you're not going through those intermediate variables, the underlying code becomes pretty short and arguably sort of reads the same way that you would read it like in English, like fetch this URL, then process the response, then handle the text. And it becomes, I don't want to say easier because it is, I think, up to each person to decide like what makes sense and what doesn't, but it's just a different way of thinking about how you organize your code. Okay, so I'm going to jump through a couple of other ways that you might think about it. And so the next thing is anonymous functions. So what we're doing here is fine and it works. However, we have these functions that really only do like one thing, and they're not like called for multiple places. They're really just used here. So instead of defining them separately and then calling them as callback functions, you can use what are called anonymous functions, which looks kind of goofy at first because what I'm going to do is I am essentially going to jam most of this into this this then block. So maybe I'll just start by writing it. So I'm going to say fetch messages.text and then call a function, and that function I can define it here. I'm going to say function, and it takes a response. And what does it do? Well, it does what I did here. So I'm going to steal this code and make sure that my parenthesis lines up. And can I prettify this? This is getting kind of gross. Yeah, there we go. And then I'm going to do the same thing here for handle text. I'm going to say then, and I'm going to define a new function, and this is going to take text, and then I am going to steal these 2 lines of code. And I'm going to prettify it. And I'm going to delete these because I don't need them anymore, and then I'll talk through it. So what this code does is pretty much the same thing as it was doing before, but now I no longer need those like separate like named functions, they would be called. I am using these functions, which are anonymous because they don't have names. I'm just sort of defining them as one-offs and saying, just use this function one time. It's a little like passing it in as like any other value instead of storing a value in a variable, but the value itself is a function, which again like gets kind of trippy, but it means that I am passing in this whole function to the then function. I'm passing a function into a function, if that makes sense. I'm not actually calling this yet. I'm just using it as my callback. And same thing here. And again, it's up to you, like what makes the most sense. But this reads a little bit like fetch the URL here, fetch the content here, and then run this whole function. And then after that returns the text promise, run that whole function. And this is pretty common because it lets you sort of see what's happening. And if it's all kind of related, then, keeping it in one place might make sense. So this is anonymous functions. And, they work, but they're a little verbose. They're a little, noisy. There's a lot of boilerplate. You have this function keyword hanging out. You've got like curly braces and stuff. So yet another way to do it is with something called arrow functions. And arrow functions are essentially a newer way to use anonymous functions without all this boilerplate. So to go from like an anonymous function, which is what we're using here, to an arrow function, you do a few things. First, you delete the keyword function, and then you have, an arrow, which is formed by an equal sign and then a greater sign. And that's essentially it. But then you have access to a couple of shortcuts. So whenever you return something from an arrow function, you can actually shorten it to remove the curly braces and then do it in like a single line. So because what I'm actually returning is just this, I'm going through a temporary variable, but really what I'm returning is the value that I get from response.text, which itself is a promise. So instead of having all of this, I can just have this. So I'm going to delete some of this and say that, and I can even delete some of that, but I generally keep it. Okay, so let me do the same thing for this second part, and then I'll sort of talk through it. Actually, I'll just do it a little bit. So I'll say delete that, and then add my arrow, which is an equal sign and greater sign, and basically that's it. Okay, so now I am using arrow functions as my anonymous functions. And again, I don't want to say like right or wrong, easier or harder, but this is just yet another way to think about it. So the way I read this is, first off, fetch the message.txt file, and then take the response and convert it into get the text from it, and then take that text and do something with it. And this is still just functions, exactly the same as when they were like named functions, but now I am just using them as values pretty much. And I am using the arrow function syntax, which is just a little more concise. So this is what I would call like the sort of most modern way to do it. But you'll see all of the approaches with the then function. So that is like different ways of using the then function, which is just different ways of giving passing in callback functions, whether that's a named function, an anonymous function, or an arrow function. They're all pretty much the same, just different syntax. However, I sort of lied when I said that it's the newest way to do it, because there is a even newer way, and that is with a couple of new keywords. So I mentioned before that the fetch function is asynchronous, which means that it like takes a while and your code keeps running while it runs in the background. And that's handy because, you don't know how long it's going to take the request to go and come back, especially if you have like a slow internet connection. And that's why you need the then keyword or the then function, because you don't want to like block your computer on waiting for the fetch function. You want to say, hey, go do your thing and then come back. But what you can do now is make your whole message or your whole function asynchronous itself. So I'm going to use the new keyword async here. And now what I can do is going to be quite a bit different from this. So I'm going to, maybe I'll just kind of start over. What the async keyword does is it tells JavaScript, it tells your browser that this whole function is asynchronous. So in fact, don't wait for me at all, which means that now, because the computer is not waiting for this function, it's doing this in the background. Now I can wait for the fetch function, like inside of this function. And the way I do that is with the await keyword. So I'm going to say, let response equals await, and then fetch message.txt. And this line of code is essentially equivalent to like this part of it. Like I'm calling the fetch function, then I'm getting the response from it. But the important thing is I'm not calling then anymore. It's sort of implicit in this keyword, the await keyword, because I'm saying, because I'm in an asynchronous function here, means like we're running in the background already. Don't worry about us. Now I can say, because we're running in the background, I can wait for the response to come back. And similarly, I can say let text equals await response.text. And then finally, I can take this stuff, get rid of all of this, and use my text. So let me clean that up a little bit. And now, because my function is asynchronous, I can await the request, I can await the text from that response, and then I can use it without any callbacks, and it still works. Welcome to my website. And if I refresh, still works. So those were a bunch of ways that you can work with promises, and there's no right or wrong. You know, if you liked the first way of using like explicit named functions in the callbacks, totally fine. If you liked sort of the arrow function syntax, that's cool. Or if you prefer async and await, all good. And I think different brains kind of bounce off each of those kind of differently, and that's totally okay. So I would recommend you to use like whatever makes the most sense to you. Okay, so there's just a couple more things I want to talk about. So now we have seen the fetch function, and we've seen a bunch of different ways to work with promises. Why are we talking about this in the first place? So this is, you know, handy enough that I can go and fetch any data that I want from files that are on the internet, from URLs that are on the internet. But where this starts to become magical is the different kinds of content you can use. So for example, I don't know, I haven't really planned this. Let's see, let's say instead of having message.txt, let's say I wanted like message.html. So I can say like message.html, and in here I can have like an HTML like fragment. Like this is not going to be a full web page. It's going to be, you know, it's going to be a little bit of HTML that I can then refer to. So let's see if I say, what do I want to say? I want to say like I don't know, I'll just have a UL, right? And I'll say li, and I'll say lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my, okay. Tigers and bears. Or tigers, not tigets. But anyway, now that I have my message.html, I can go use that in my JavaScript. So I can say, instead of fetching message.txt, I'm going to fetch message.html. And then instead of, so what you see over here is like it's adding my HTML as text. So instead of inner text here, I'm going to say inner HTML. Inner HTML. And sure enough, there we go. I am adding HTML content to my page from JavaScript, even though that HTML came from a separate file. So this is really powerful because this is how a lot of like modern web development happens, where you have your content sort of all over the place, and you use JavaScript to like go fetch data, go fetch, you know, different parts of the page, and then you combine them into one whole kind of using JavaScript. And then the last thing I want to talk about is another kind of content. So we've seen text and we've seen HTML, and the next thing I want to talk about is a format called JSON, JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. And that sounds maybe, I don't know, a little weird, but I'll talk through it. So I'm going to create a new file, and I don't know, let's call it like messages.json. These extensions don't really matter, but they're kind of reminders of what kind of content is going to be in that file. And in here, what I'm going to put is some text, but it's going to be formatted in a way that looks a lot like JavaScript. And I'll show you what I mean. So remember from, I don't know, a couple lessons ago that we talked about objects. We've talked about arrays, and the syntax for creating those is like with square brackets for arrays and curly brackets for objects. So I'm going to use that. I'm going to have like some square brackets. So I'm going to create an array, and then inside of my array, I'm usually going to have objects. So I'm going to have like curly braces, and then I'm going to separate them with commas. Right now, these are kind of just empty objects that don't actually contain any fields, but let's fill them out. So maybe I'll say like field number 1 is message, and really the only difference between JavaScript object notation or JSON and regular old JavaScript is the fields in your objects are surrounded by quotes. So I'm going to say quotation mark, and I'm going to call this like, I don't know, message, and then I get a colon, and then another one. I'm just going to say like, I don't know, welcome to my site. And maybe I'll make it interesting, and I'll give it like another field, and I'll say color, I don't know, like red. So the thing to sort of notice is this is mostly just JavaScript actually, where I'm defining an array and then defining an object, and that object contains a message field, which points to a value of welcome to my site. And then it contains a color field, which points to a string of red. So I can add a few. I'll say message. I always make that typo, and I'll say, I don't know, like hello world, and I'll give it a color of green maybe. And then one more, I'll say message, I don't know, I love JSON, and then a color of blue. Okay, so now I've got my array of objects, and those objects contain fields, and it's in its own file. It's in messages.json. And now where it all sort of comes together is I can use the fetch function to get this data and then use it in my JavaScript. So let me go back to script.js here, and I guess I'll stick with async and await just because it's already here, but this approach will work for, you know, callback functions or arrow functions, you know, whatever you want to use, the same thing will work. You would just, you know, use whatever format you want. But the important thing is that I'm going to change just a couple things. So first I'm going to fetch, what did I call that? Messages.json. So the name of my file. And instead of getting the text, I'm going to call the JSON function, and I can get that from the response object. So instead of calling text like this, I'm going to call JSON. And this is taking the JSON that is in my, you know, requested file and getting it out of that response. And I'll change this to like my array maybe, or array messages array, you know, whatever you want to call it. So now I have this messages array, which is what I put in my file. And finally, what do I want to do? So I have an array of objects. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just get the first one out for now. Let message equals messages array. And remember, when you're indexing into an array, the 0th index is the first one. So I'm just taking that first message out. And then finally, I am saying set my message container dot inner text equal to my message dot, what did I call it? Oh boy, I called it message, didn't I? So it's going to get a little gross. It's message dot message. I don't love that, but that is a symptom of using the same name here that I did in here. So every object is a message. The messages contain message. Maybe I should call this text actually, but I'll keep it message for now. But back in my script, I think that should be all I need to do. Inner text message.message, and sure enough, that still works. So if I change this to a 1, I should now get the second object from my array. And if I change it to a 2, then I should get the third object. And notice that like I'm not defining that array here. That array is over in my other file, and I'm fetching it, converting it into a JavaScript object, which is pretty much what this function here does, and then I'm using it. So I could get a little more interesting. So I added a color field to that that object. So let's use that. Let's go back here and say, let's see if I can remember this off the top of my head. Message container dot style dot color equals message dot color, I think. And yeah, now it's blue. It's kind of hard to see on the video, but now it's blue. And that is because if I go to my file, my JSON file, I love JSON should be colored blue. And it's, it's just what I defined in there, but it's because I am fetching this file that I can then use it in my JavaScript. So just to make it a little interesting, instead of hard coding 0, 1, or 2 here, maybe I'll like create a randomized index. So I'll say like let index equals, and let's see if I remember how to do this all the time in my head. Math.random times messages array dot length. And then I think I need to math.floor that whole thing. And if you don't know how to generate a random number between like 0 and some other number, you can look it up. But this is like a magical line of code that I use pretty often. So now if I refresh this a few times, every time I refresh, I should see kind of a random choice of those 3 messages. So let's refresh. And okay, this is, oh wait, I'm not actually using that, am I? I haven't actually used my index. So instead of 2, I'm going to say index. And let's see if the randomness gods are on our side. They are. So now I get welcome to my site in red. If I refresh, it's kind of random, but now I get I love JSON in blue. If I refresh, let's see how long it takes me to get to the other one. There's hello world. And it's kind of random. So you'll get repeats, multiple of the same message and color in a row. But if I had more messages in here, then you can imagine that every time I log into my webpage, or every time I load my webpage, I get a different random message, and those messages are defined in a separate file that is, not part of my JavaScript, and that makes it easier to like separate your data from your actual code. And then the very last thing I'll talk about is the fact that where this really becomes interesting is this URL can be pretty much anything. So far I have been using files that I personally created in my project here, in my glitch project. So I created like message.txt, message.html, and finally message.json. But if you can find other URLs that give you data, then you can use those too in your code. So I have a couple of sort of pre-built examples here. So I have put together this JSON file, which is pretty similar. No, back here I did use text. Okay, great. So I'll change that line of code in a second, but this is pretty similar, just a few more, but this is just out on the internet. This URL is not part of my glitch project. It's like, just on the internet. So I'm going to fetch this URL. Well, I'm also going to remember to use this as my variable name because apparently I planned ahead back when I created this file, but then forgot. So I don't know, let me be annoying and real quick, change this to text, this to text, and this to text. And then, okay, so now it's broken for now, but let's fix it by saying message.text here. And yeah, okay. So that's just changing the message variable to text so that I don't have to say message.message anymore. And finally, drum roll, is I just took the URL from this file which is just a regular old URL, HTTPS, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to paste it into here. So instead of loading the messages.json file that's like next to my script.js file in Glitch, I'm going to paste this in, and it's that file that's from the internet, and it works because I am calling the fetch function, getting the JSON from it, and then working with the resulting objects. So now if I refresh a bunch of times, I will see the sort of welcome messages that are defined in that file, in that other file. So refresh, and okay, it's up to randomness, but here's a meow, here's bienvenido, here's meow again, here's hello visitor, and you can imagine that someone else can create the file, put it on the internet somewhere, and you can use it. And this is really similar to the idea of like JavaScript libraries. Only instead of JavaScript libraries, it's like data libraries. And that brings us to the next concept, which is APIs, which are pretty much data libraries. But I want to talk about that in its own video. So for now, what I want you to sort of take away from this is the fetch function is a thing. It returns a promise. Promises are weird, but there are a bunch of ways to work with them, from callback functions to arrow functions to async and await. And no right or wrong there. You can use whatever makes the most sense to you. But what they let you do is fetch data, fetch content from other URLs, and then use that in your JavaScript and in your own page. So that's the takeaway from this video, and we're going to use that to do some really interesting things with APIs and data, but I'll save that for the next one. So for now, thanks for watching, and as always, happy coding.